And thanks to one and all for your support of Chesapeake Forum. Please spread the word that this is a very good organization, and we have to give credit to Lynn and the leadership for having made this out of really basically nothing. So thank you, well done. We all profit from
You're doing a great job of pushing Chesapeake Forum for us. But we really want to thank you because you've been such a good person doing all these.
It's my pleasure. The privilege to introduce you to the history of the papacy.
You taught me how to say it right too.
Now, you already have received the monograph on the papacy, and I think there are 8 of these chapters that will be either distributed or sent to you. They're fine as far as if you miss a class or a meeting, you will not miss that much, because most of the information is there. There will be information in your handouts that we do not cover. There will be a lot of information that we just cannot cover with the time allotted. Originally, this course was a 45-hour graduate school class at Duquesne University.
Wow.
That is 45 hours counting exams, counting quizzes, counting term papers, counting discussion, counting debate, counting defending your position on a paper, that kind of activity that was turned off. So this is the very, very basic of the course on the papacy. One thing that we need to remember, this I want to deliver as the first item of business. The papacy is based on the office of the Bishop of Rome. We can say, yeah, sure, Bishop of Rome, yeah, what? Big deal. No, this is a big deal. Because Rome was the largest city in antiquity, and for many, many years has been the wealthiest city. That's where Christianity grew rapidly. And that is where the wealth of the church accumulated early on. And the church then became poorer, and then it became richer, and then it has ups and downs. But the key position to remember is that the Pope is the Bishop of Rome. We will make that point several times throughout this course in order to emphasize the importance of him being the Bishop of Rome. He is also known as the head of the Catholic Church, Supreme Pontiff, Patriarch of the West, the Metropolitan of Italy. A metropolitan is, this you know, is like an archbishop of archbishops. So it's a top dog amongst a series of archbishops. A metropolitan is usually located in a large city, like Milan, Rome, or Paris, or Berlin. Get the idea here in the States? I think there's a couple of metropolitans in the East, and then strike around Los Angeles. So it's a super archbishop. He's also now the head of state and head of government of Vatican City since 1929, when the Vatican made peace with the state of Italy under Mussolini. So this brought, we will touch on that, brought about a lot of legitimacy to Mussolini and his government. We will discuss, therefore, the origins and the establishment and evolution of the papacy, then from the Middle Ages to the Great Eastern Schism. That's when things get really interesting. The Middle Ages get really, really interesting. For one thing, they were very well documented. And all those documents stay in the Vatican. You know, the Vatican gets criticized for having all those documents hidden away, and nobody's allowed to see them except with special permission. They're saving them. Otherwise, they will get destroyed by people pulling them over back and forth and forth and back. They're basically saving them. And all of these documents, you see, are still available. Yes?
No,
No.
because they can digitalize them and we can all read them. That's not the point to protect the paper, I don't. They protect other things.
Right. Would you mind making your point again? I could not hear you.
I said that it's not to protect the paper or the document itself. It's a I don't know, it's an object, but it's to protect what is in the documents, because right now they can digitalize everything. So it can be accessible from anywhere. I don't have to go in Rome to read it.
The point that you're making, and this is generally correct for recent documents. For old documents, they have released photocopies, and they have released the text of the documents, like the letters between Henry and the Emperor, and we'll get into that. They have the originals, but they're not showing them. But everybody knows what the letters read. The text is available to all. Yes, in modern things, in some things, particularly things that are embarrassing to the church, they do not want to release those documents. Who would? But as far as historical accuracy, copies and photocopies have been made and distributed. So thanks for bringing that up. All right. Then the late Middle Ages, Avignon, and the Great Western Schism. Something that we do not wish to live through. That lasted 38 years. Then the Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation, one of the biggest crises of the papacy. Napoleon and the French Revolution, and then the second part of the 19th century with Pius IX, Italian reunification, and Vatican I. The 20th century was a story all by itself, and then finally the 21st century and the many scandals. The authority over Christianity issue has always been one of the major concerns of Christianity as a whole. It is based on two issues. Number one, or the teaching of the doctrine of Petrine primacy. And the second on the doctrine of apostolic succession. It is generally agreed, but not completely agreed, that Peter was something special. Whether it was because he was hard-headed, or because he was strong, or because he was odd, or because he was loyal. It's really hard to tell, because there are many conflicting characteristics in Peter. He was the one who denied Jesus, so he was not without fault. But generally in the Gospels, we can say that Peter was recognized as a leader. He was singled out for his faith He was at the Transfiguration, whatever that was. And he was given the authority to control and build up the new church. We can argue very rapidly that there is very little evidence other than Matthew 16 that Jesus wanted to build another church. There is very little. Nowadays, the point is mute because the churches are there. They exist. And whether he wanted to build churches or not, it will move. But as far as the Gospels are concerned, he never, other than Matthew 16, he never said, I want to build a church. He was a good Jewish rabbi. He was a good teacher. But it is not clear whether he ever wanted to build a church away from Judaism. The doctrine of apostolic succession has to deal with Peter's authority and position being transferred directly from Jesus to the Bishop of Rome. Not the Bishop of Alexandria, not the Bishop of Jerusalem, not the Bishop of Corinth, directly. Not through an intermediary, directly from the Lord Jesus to the Bishop of Rome. We can say that was Peter the lead apostle. Well, we'll see when we discuss the Acts of the Apostles that in Jerusalem, Peter was not the top dog. James was the top dog in Jerusalem. So you can see that the evidence is variable and at times conflicting. But Peter and Paul were perhaps martyred in Rome, and Rome is considered an apostolic city. Now, Jews had a colony in Rome long before the first century. Judaism was present in Rome for perhaps hundreds of years before the Christians came over. So that's another thing to take into consideration, that there was already there a Jewish community when Christianity approached. Let's look at the keys to the kingdom. This is the famous picture by Il Perugino that is in the Sistine Chapel. It's on the right-hand side on the north wall when you walk in, up about 15 feet. So in order to really see it, you have to go to the south wall and turn 90 degrees, and there it is, in all its splendor. The keys to the kingdom. It's more of an exercise in perspective than anything else. You can see all the lines converging right over here on the plaza. And here Jesus is giving Peter the keys. And the quote from Matthew 16 is, "Thou art Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." Probably the only time that Jesus is quoted as saying anything about a church. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. All right. In other words, it will be protected. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. I always had problem with these things in Morris.
Yes. What's the timing of Matthew 16? When was it written?
What time?
Yeah, I mean, when was it written?
When was it written?
Yeah.
Yeah, Matthew was written probably in the 70s. The first gospel is Mark. And then after Mark, Luke and Matthew draw from Mark. and probably from a fourth source called the Quell, Quelle. The Quell. That does not exist anymore. But a number of people in the Middle Ages referred to the Quell document. There are stories in Matthew and in Luke that are not in Mark.
So Peter is in Rome before 70, before this is written.
Oh, way.
So I guess my question is, as this is written, that gives Peter this capability to build this church, and it's written after Peter.
Oh, Peter is DEAD for a long time. When this was his. You see, Jesus promised them a return. I will return and I will establish the kingdom of God. So they waited and waited and waited and waited. And then they realized, he's not coming. We better write down something so that the next generation has. And that's how the Gospels came about. But it was all a lot of hearsay. Matthew knew Jesus, but Luke, no. Mark, no. John, no. God knows what John had been smoking when he wrote the Gospel and the Apocalypse. Because it's absolutely absurd and fantastic. The message of Jesus, he gets straight. But all the other stuff, out of this world. So it was, all the four evangelists had different reasons to write the gospel. But basically, they wanted to lay a foundation for the next generation who would sit around and wait for Jesus to come back. But he would not necessarily right away.
What about the authorship of some of these?
Oh, I get criticized whenever I bring up the old game of telephone.
Oh, yeah.
Remember, you started with having to tell a story, and the story goes around, and by the time it gets here, it's totally different. So the same thing with all of these legends and stories. Yes, please.
Well, I have a question about Peter going to Rome. Why? So they lived at the same time with Jesus.
Right.
They were together. And I know there was a big Jewish community in Rome. I understand that. But Jesus never went to Rome.
No.
He spread his teaching in Jerusalem around, like whatever. And I know that this is all metaphorical. Upon this rock I will build my church. Doesn't mean rock, but still, why would he go in Rome? And the Rome who killed Jesus, then you go and you give power to the bishop of Rome. It's like at the beginning it's all controversial. And then from there we can go that we live in today.
We will address that same issue momentarily.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing it up. You're right on track. Yes, please.
So I also wonder, when was the word by church? Because back in Jesus' time, it was temples. So is this one of those telephone things where was the word church?
Is it modern, right?
The Gospels were written in Greek or in Aramaic. And and from those languages they were translated into Latin. And from those languages they were then translated into other languages. And every editor changed things. Sometimes a little bit, sometimes a little bit more.
The implication is that Jesus said these words, that Peter was going to kind of build this church on this rock. But those words were written 70 years after Jesus was dead, after Peter had already done his stuff. Right? So in the normal world, we'd say, well, we're writing it retroactively to make it work out.
Well,
Not that it actually came forward in a.
even nowadays, when we have TV and videotape, people argue about what other people said.
Right, yeah.
Anything.
All right, thank you. Great discussion. So these are concerns about, the other thing is, whatever you lose on earth, that be loosed in heaven. What if the Bishop of Rome or the bearer of the keys decides to change something that is very moral? Is that going to apply in heaven? Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not desire thy neighbor's wife. I always had problems with that. Always had, because my neighbor's wife was a real dog. Was so nasty. She was personally, how could my neighbor himself even desire her? I could not understand that. I always had problems with that one.
Your confessions must have been really
Oh,
interesting.
I'm sorry, Father, if I've sinned. I do not.
You can see what, the epistles of St. Paul are probably the oldest documents. And these were written probably in the 60s or so. Paul never recognizes Peter as a leader. He never recognizes him as a bishop either. Actually, Peter and Paul have a confrontation at Antioch that is written in Galatians 2. Apparently, Peter was having dinner with the Gentiles that were trying to become Christians. And that was fine until some Jews came in. And then Peter immediately rejected the Gentiles and went to eat with the Jews. And Paul said, no, that's not the way we're going to run this sect. We're all going to be the same. We're all the souls of God. Gentiles and Christians, we're all the same. So he took it on, and it's in Galatians 2, no? And this is one of the authentic Pauline epistles.
Wasn't this a real speed bump to the growth of Christianity?
I am so sorry, my hearing is bad.
My understanding is this was a real speed bump to the growth of Christianity. If you had to be circumcised to become Jew, to become a Christian, it sort of slowed the whole process down.
We get to that in the next slide again. Thank you. Anticipating stuff. So the other item that we need to consider is the Council of Jerusalem, which is what you were referring to, Mike. The Council of Jerusalem, we will touch in the next slide. After we talk a little about the Acts of the Apostles, who were written by Luke, who knew Peter and traveled with Paul, but he never knew Jesus. All right, so again, a lot of hearsay, a lot of secondary evidence, a lot of words that have been filtered over many generations. Peter exercises a position of leadership, but he's not the chief leader in Jerusalem. James is. So the Council of Jerusalem, which was what you were referring to, was really the first Christian revolution. The main issue was circumcision. Also to be discussed were the dietary laws and promiscuity. Basically, Paul and his friends, his secretary, his scribe, came to Jerusalem and said, look, Peter, look, James, let's get together and straighten this thing out. The Jerusalem community of Christians were all Jews. It was really a sect, a Jewish sect that wanted to follow the law, wanted to go to the synagogue, had been circumcised, followed the dietary laws, but also followed the teachings of Jesus. The same way that many follow the teachings of John the Baptist. The same way that many follow the teachings of many other preachers at that time. Those were the ones that James and Peter and the others tried to maintain in the Christian community. Paul, on the other hand, went to other cities around Asia Minor and around the Mediterranean. He tried to evangelize the Gentiles, the non-Jews. The Jews in Jerusalem said, look, for these Gentiles to become Christians, they have to become Jews first. They have to observe the Sabbath. They have to have circumcision. They have to give up some of the sexual practices. And, circumcision, even in today's day and age, with great anesthesia and hospital care, it's a major procedure. It's not an outpatient procedure. Very, very painful, very, very disabling, not just for a day or two, for weeks. So the ancients were kind of reluctant to undergo a procedure like that, which at that time must have been in an adult rather coarse, to say the least. We need to make a decision about these things. So at the Council of Jerusalem, Peter was the first one who spoke, then Paul, and lastly James, because James was the leader. And they said, all right, we'll give in. Because you have a chance of making more converts than we do. So go ahead, sure, baptize them and bringing him to the community, and they don't have to be circumcised. What was the background for circumcision?
And the health.
Yeah, it was a health issue, something called phimosis and varicose. Without good hygiene and care, an infection takes place between the covering, the prepuce, and the glands, and adhesions occur. And eventually that tightens the canal of the urine, and people get renal failure, kidney failure. So in order to prevent phimosis and paraphimosis, the Jews found out that if you just cut the foreskin, children have no choice but to wash themselves on a regular basis. So it was a health issue that they eventually sold to the people as the agreement with God, and this is how God wants to define you and make you special and the like. But it was certainly, the Jews were good at that. They also established for the army latrines. The army of biblical times were not expected to relieve themselves on their grounds or go to the latrine where their excrement and urine could be excluded. They were good at public health. The thing about shellfish is that shellfish tend to inhabit the narrow or the shallow waters of rivers and streams and the like. And this is where people relieve themselves. That's where people don't go out in the deep to relieve themselves. So that's where all these things have a public health background. The end of the story was that they came to an agreement, but very wisely. Paul said, I want it in writing. I want it in writing so I can show people what you agreed on. I'm not leaving here until you write it down. So they had to write it down and give it to him. And that document has now survived. Only the reference to it survived for all this time. Now, why did Peter go to Rome? It's been a good question for a long time. Why do people go to New York? Why do
Well, I mean,
people?
that was the center, I understand that, but why would you give the power to Bishop of Rome, not as Bishop of Jerusalem, or, I don't know, create something?
There are many questions that we don't know. Why do people go to Washington?
Because they want power, so.
Why do people go to Berlin? Why do people go to Madrid?
No, but that's my point, like whether creating the church itself, structure, at the very beginning, it was not so much about being around people and serving the people, but being a power and being a player. That's my-
Probably, you're correct. Probably power was the right thing. But look at poor Peter was a fisherman. He was probably uneducated. He probably did not speak either Latin or Greek. He probably just spoke Aramaic. He was not top dog of the church in general. He must have, in Rome, he must have felt like a fish out of water.
It's been pretty ambitious.
So, nobody referred to him as bishop. Maybe he was there to develop communities. He was in Antioch and Corinth for a while. Did he want to convert the Romans? Well, many of the Romans had converted already. There was already a community there. There were mostly Jews that had accepted Christianity. But then Rome was the capital of the empire, the seat of government, the source of power, the center of justice. That's why Paul went to Rome. Paul had been accused of crimes, and he said, "Ooh, civitatis Romanus sum. I am a citizen of Rome. I am entitled to a fair trial in Rome." So you want a trial? All right, we'll put you on the list. Go over and wait a few years, just like ICE does. Go. And that's what happened to Paul and Peter. So the reasons why Peter went to Rome are not altogether clear. We may have some hypotheses and some theories, but really nothing really hard. We have said that the early Christians were primarily Jews that went to the synagogue, kept the law, took care of each other, and Christianity spread from city to city first. Very little penetration into the countryside. Christianity made really big inroads in the first and second century into the Gentiles, not into the Jewish community, into the Gentiles. Most of early Christianity after the first century was made up of Gentiles. So the number of Christians grew approximately 40% every 10 years. That's tremendous growth. Therefore, organization became a necessity. There were so many Christians that they had to get organized somewhere. And this is a map of early Christianity, how in the deep blue, near the water, Black Sea, Eastern Mediterranean, the Western Mediterranean, Spain, and North Africa too. Let's not forget North Africa. Christianity spread very rapidly in North Africa. There was no Muslim religion at that time. So Christianity really grew very, very fast in Morocco and Egypt, particularly Egypt, and in other countries bordering the Mediterranean.
Wait,
This,
when did the Muslim religion come about?
which was the Muslim?
Yeah.
Was this 5th or 6th century? When was Muhammad around? Somewhere around 6th or 7th.
611 or 13 or something, or something like
Somewhere in there in the dark ages.
Yeah.
We'll figure it out. Come up with that. You too. The key thing to remember about this period is that the organization of Christian communities was modeled after Roman civil government structures. So the church and its communities organized according to the Roman structure. Therefore, there was an episcopal, over scope watch, an overwatcher, an overseer, who would be the main officer at worship, baptism, and other activities. This was a very pyramidal structure. This is important because in the East, we will see how it was not pyramidal, but rather a horizontal structure. The elders or presbyters were advisors and deputies. In other words, these were usually older individuals who could not do a lot of work, but were good to have around to give guidance and perspective. The deacons organized the charity work. The prophets instructed the catechumens, and those were the ones that were learning all this stuff in the catechism to become fully fledged Christians. So this is the key thing, and this probably added a lot to the development of the Roman Church, that the communities were developed according to the Roman structure of government. Again, everything in turn of the bishop, the episcopos of Rome.
Is it why that they are allowed to exist?
Or there are,
They're allowed to exist as a church? I mean, on one side you have like they killed Jesus, and then in the middle of Rome you have creation of this church who spread a different religion or a religion organized. It's just totally weird. I mean, it doesn't make sense unless Rome overtook it and then allow it in a way to expand the power.
It sounds like they did sort of, since they ended up modeling everything after Rome.
many of these things, your opinion is as good as many. Because many of these things are totally
But if you think about it, right, that was the only model of organization that they commonly knew, right? So they weren't going to create something new. So using a model that they saw that worked and people understood would make sense. Because, I mean, as this slide says, right, the persecution, right? We were taught, right, Daniel and the lion and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know if if the Romans leadership was happy about Christianity growing. I don't get the sense they
No,
were.
but they couldn't stop it. That's what I'm saying. So once
Right.
you can stop it, you overtake it in a way and make it yours. But
Right,
not
right.
that you don't have other communities. You still have Greeks.
Yeah, like I'm
You
joining.
have the Eastern part, which is whatever that was.
Right.
Great discussion, thank you. Let's talk a little bit about the persecutions. We already mentioned the possibility that Peter went to Rome to avoid persecution. It's unlikely that he was being persecuted there in Corinth or in Jerusalem. But let's clear this up. The persecutions of Christians were intermittent. They were not continuous. The Romans did not persecute the Christians all the time, only at particular times. The other thing was that they were all often localized, sometimes in only Italy, sometimes in Gaul, sometimes in Germany, sometimes in Asia Minor, and the major, not empire-wide. The ones that are best known are the ones by Nero, Decius in the middle of the 3rd century, and Diocletian in the beginning of the 4th century. Why were Christians persecuted? Well, they were different. They did not worship Roman gods. They ate the body of Jesus and drank his blood. They called each other brother and sister. They were critical of governments, but then the Christians always demanded government or protection from government. And lastly, they worshiped, according to them, as God a convicted and executed criminal who also claimed resurrection. In these terms, it looks quite fantastic, the whole thing. In the middle of the 3rd century, Stephen was elected Bishop of Rome. How did that happen? Probably something like this. The former Bishop of Rome got sick and died dead. So the Christians here said, we don't have a bishop. Let's get together and find a bishop. All right, let's meet at my place. Good. I'll bring dinner. I'll bring bread. I'll bring wine. So they'll get together and say, well, how about Lucy for bishop? No, she's a woman. How about so-and-so? Patient? No. How about Stephen? Oh, hey, Stephen, you want to be a bishop? All right, but only for a few years. I don't have many years left.
This wasn't the Stephen that was stoned, right?
It was not.
This was not the Stephen that was stoned?
No.
I think it's the bishop of bishops. Were these people that were elected also leaders of groups? They were bishops too?
Yeah, they were. We'll get to that eventually on the 7 cardinal bishops around Rome. But this is the way that the original bishops were elected. The Christians got together the same way that we get together at a homeowners association. So who wants to be the leader? Well, how about him? No, me. I served a term. No more.
I'm not time for this.
Basically, that's why. It was the people and the clergy, the Christians, that elected the bishop or bishop. So it was a very popular, open election. Stephen called himself Bishop of Bishops. In other words, being in Rome, being in the power, or the center of power, I am going to have jurisdiction over the other bishops around Rome, and maybe outside Rome. He supported the deposed Spanish bishops. They had not behaved very well, and they were deposed by their own diocese. He would not grant reconciliation to any Christian that had been persecuted and had renounced his beliefs. He held that a baptism by a heretic bishop or priest was valid. Many people thought that if the priest that baptizes a child is a heretic, that baptism is invalid. But he claimed primacy of the Roman Church and its bishop. He said the Roman Church is here, the top dog of the churches around Rome. Bishop of Rome. Once again, the importance of the office. So that was the first step. In the middle of the 3rd century, first time that we can say, well, there is a definite leader there, elected by the people of Rome, that assumes some kind of responsibility and authority over the others. The next episode of the papacy that we should study is the Edict of Milan at the beginning of the 4th century. Constantine and Licinius, the emperors of the east and the emperors of the west, granted freedom of worship to all. You could worship whoever you want. You could worship Jesus or God the Father or a mixture of two or other gods or the Roman gods, whatever you want to worship, fine with us. It's not a government issue at this time. But he restored property and civil rights to the Christians, including a lot of real estate in Rome. So the Bishop of Rome now had various properties in Rome and also had the Lateran Palace, which we will look at in a little while. The Lateran Palace, the Lateran Basilica was built next to it, and the Pope lived there until they came back from Avignon in the 14th century. So the Pope also gained property in other places outside Rome called extraterritorial property. Licinius and Constantine made the Roman Church wealthy. They gave the Roman Church real estate and power.
I have a question for this slide. I have a question for the slide. So this Edict of Milan, it's written on paper.
Yeah, it's written very,
But they use Latin at that point.
they use Latin, yes.
This is all in Greek, so is it because just it's depicted as an icon, so it's
Well, this-
all in Greek?
I think this is just a picture of a king and some churchmen getting together.
Which is not, those are not Constantine and Licinius.
No, this is just for illustration.
I thought that,
No, they just got together, had a few drinks.
yeah, no, I was confused by that.
I went to the club, played golf. So the Christians were also granted exemption from taxes.
Started early.
Yeah, what a sweet deal, huh?
Nice way to get remembered.
The Christians had jurisdiction over church matters. In other words, Constantine said, look, your business, your affairs, you deal with them. Right? Don't come to me.
But who exempt them from tax at that point? Because it's already accepted as a state religion.
No, not yet.
But then who exempt them from taxes? Roman Empire?
Yeah.
But can't.
Were other organizations that were religious at the time exempted?
I'm not sure about other
Is
organizations,
it weird?
but certainly the Christian faith and the Bishop of Rome was exempted from taxes.
So those folks and those organizations, as you pointed out, were made extremely wealthy.
Very wealthy.
And so the idea that Constantine would accidentally make them wealthy seems odd. Seems like there must have been a purpose for them to transfer that kind of power.
That's great that you brought up to this point because we can make a point here that is to be remembered. Most of the wealth of the Catholic Church is now vested on the diocese. So bishops are wealthy. We will see that particularly in the Middle Ages, where they were installed with the ring and the scepter, when they were basically dukes. Positions as bishops or dioceses were often sold up until modern ages. They were sold for the income of 1 year from all the properties of that diocese. That was the rule of thumb. You want to be bishop? All right, it's going to cost you up front, and it's going to cost you the first year's income of the whole diocese. So that diocese had a lot of real estate, and rents came from there. Some people believe that the fact that priests were kept from marrying were to prevent them from having legitimate children. If they don't have legitimate children, nobody can have any inheritance. Their property therefore goes to the church. That's just what some people have advocated. But nevertheless, we're kind of going in a tangent here. The important thing, the diocese, the bishop of Rome, diocese of Rome became very, very wealthy. So there were also many endowments and funds for construction, particularly the old St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican Hill. Now, why was the Edict of Milan issued? Why did Constantine all of a sudden give the church all of this power and all of this wealth? Well, Constantine may not want to infuriate or piss off the Christian God. He was superstitious. He said, look, this God is powerful. I don't want to mess with him. We'll tolerate him, but I don't want to mess with him. He wanted peace. And he wanted tranquility at home. And he realized that Christianity was a stabilizing force. The Romans liked that idea of, do unto others like they do unto you, and be fair to others and have justice. Justice was in their frame of mind, the laws. And they particularly liked that business of one rest day a week. The Sabbath, that was very, very attractive to them. So Christianity really appealed to Romans. And Christianity was then eventually tied to the civil government. Why? Because the Diocese of Rome did many of the things that government does or did and really does not want to do. How about birth certificates? How about marriage certificates? How about death certificates? How about baptism? All those records were kept by the church. All those records were kept by the diocese. So the government really didn't have to worry about it. And that way, Christianity was tied to the civil government very easily.
But how was he so freed from God when he married his mother? I mean, that has nothing to do with being a good Christian.
Their opinion is as good as any. Keen observation. Why, on the other hand, why did the church accept the Edict of Milan? Well, the church wanted to end the persecution. They wanted to be left in peace. And they wanted political protection. They welcomed economic support. Who wouldn't? Hey, pie in the sky, no taxes, real estate, buildings. So the church ceased being a purely religious institution and became wealthy and a branch of the government. That was a key point in the development of Christianity and the papacy.
That was pretty early on, too.
Christianity became a branch of the government. Well, Rome was the map of the Roman Empire in 117 AD. Who came up with that number? I don't know, but it's just as good as any. Look how big the Roman Empire was. And Rome was right here in the middle of the boot of Italy. And if you draw a line right through Rome, you can see that 2/3 of the empire are to the east. And 1/3 is to the west. Where Constantine said, this is too far to travel. We have to send all these legions and support them, and let's move the city of Rome elsewhere. No, you can't do this. Look. Rome is terribly hot in the summertime. You've been to Rome in the summertime, you know how terrible it is, unless you're very close to a fountain. And what's that? That's why there are so many fountains in Rome. There are local air conditioning units to fight the heat. Besides, it was infested with bugs. Malaria was rampant. All of Rome is surrounded by what's the word I'm having at the moment? Yeah, thank you. And you know that the marshes, Mussolini drained them all. And during the Second World War, the Germans opened up the valves and flooded the area again. But the problem with the marshes and the mosquitoes and malaria was really a major, major problem. So Constantine was able to sell the move of the capital out east. And where did they go? They go to this place called the Bosphorus. The modern city of Istanbul is the equivalent of the old city of Constantinople. The Hippodrome is still there. The monuments are still there. Hagia Sophia is still there. The Church of Holy Wisdom. But the most important thing about Istanbul or Constantinople was that it was defensible. On the one side is the Black Sea, and then a very thin stretch of land called the Bosphorus. Some people have felt that, remember the flood, the biblical flood? The biblical flood may have occurred when the Bosphorus opened up and allowed all the water from the Mediterranean to flow into the Black Sea. That's one of the theories of evolution of the area. But the land is very fertile. There is plenty of fresh water coming from the north. And from the south, you have the Sea of, well, the English say Marmara. The Turks say Marmara. So we can say either one. So there is a lot of seafood. The Sea of Marmara or Marmara is very much like the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of fresh, healthy, good seafood. There are other cities around like Chalcedon. We know Chalcedon because there will be an ecumenical council there, and Nicaea back here in this corner. On the other hand, the southwest approach to the Sea of Marmara was through the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles are a very thin channel, and at its narrowest, it is about half a kilometer. Very, very defensive. Just put a few guns up in the hills and no ship is going to get through. Winston Churchill found that out during the First World War. You know that story. When he sent the British Army to attack the Dardanelles in an effort to enter Istanbul, and the Turks had guns on both sides of the Dardanelles and mines, and they rapidly lost a handful of warships. And right here in this little peninsula is where Gallipoli was. Remember the movie?
Yeah.
Movie Gallipoli, where the Anzac troops landed here and tried to fight their way into Turkey this way, but never got anywhere. So it's eminently defensible, even in the 20th century. So the benefits of moving the capital to the east were considerable. On the other hand, they left the church behind. They were not going to take the bishop or the church structure because that was the bishop of Rome. they installed their own bishop of Constantinople, their own patriarch of Constantinople, their own hierarchy of bishops in Constantinople. The Bishop of Rome stayed behind to fend for himself, and the diocese still had the properties, still had the rents, still had the wealth, but not the support of the civil government. One of the problems that early Christianity was that of different beliefs, doctrine. What are we going to believe in? And some people began to have different beliefs about the nature of Jesus, the nature of his wills, the nature of the persons, the Trinity, when Jesus became God, all these little things. Oh, sometimes it appears to be like hair splitting, these changes in doctrine. And these were primarily developed in the east of the empire, not the west. Remember, the East Empire spoke Greek. The Western Empire spoke Latin. So these fine differences in doctrine were best explained in Greek. Latin was not good to explain those subtle differences. Like the three persons in one God. Those were very easy to explain in Greek, but not so much in Latin. So changes began to occur, and people began to fight each other physically over beliefs. Yeah, people were dying over their beliefs. So the Emperor Constantine called up Bishop or the Patriarch in Constantinople and said, "Look, Patriarch, you need to put an end to this. You need to get together and come up with a statement that says what you believe. We can't go on having these people believe one thing, you believe another, and they believe a third set of circumstances. You have to get together." So they got together in Nicaea. Nicaea was that little town to the east of Constantinople, and that was where the Nicene Creed comes from. I believe in God the Father Almighty, etc., etc. Well, thank you. Thank you so very much. Did you miss it, Jim? Thank you, very sweet of you. Yeah, thoughtful. So the Council of Nicaea in 321 was called by the emperor. That's the first thing to remember. Oh, it had nothing to do with it. Sylvester was Bishop of Rome. He did not even send a commission to the council. He said, "No, I'm bishop in Rome. I'm bishop of the area of Rome. I may be a super bishop, but no, this is, you don't have any problem. You are the ones who have the problem." Why did they go to Nicaea? Why do big groups go to Las Vegas for a convention? Because in Las Vegas you have meeting rooms, you have hotel rooms, you can cater a party, you have drink, you have entertainment. So all these things were present in those little towns. There were rooms to sleep in, meeting rooms, there were scribes to keep notes and copy documents. So that's why the Council of Nicaea came about where it did. And just,
Turn it off back in again.
So at that point, there is still no pope, or you consider Stephen the bishop of Rome not being a pope?
I did it. But
You make that arrow.
let's bring up,
no, I don't think so. I think it just went to. Yeah, it's
we
goes to sleep too fast.
okay, thank you. All right. So the Sylvester did not call the council, the government called the council. The emperor called the council. And that was the rule for a long time. An ecumenical council was called by the emperor, not by the Bishop of Rome. The council condemned Arius. Arius was a very holy and pious bishop in Alexandria. And his problem was that he taught that the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, Jesus, the Word, was not eternal like the Father, but had begun at a moment in time eternal. In other words, the Logos had not been there with the Father in the very, very beginning, if there was a beginning, but rather began at a specific time before there was time. You can see how this is kind of difficult to translate into Latin, difficult to translate into English. But in Greek, apparently it is relatively easy. I don't know, my opinion is so great to me. I don't understand a word that they say, but that was the thing. The council also formulated the Nicene Creed that lives to this day and settled the Quartodeciman controversy. This was regarding Easter. They were fighting each other over when to celebrate Easter.
Still are.
And the other problem that they addressed was Donatism. We may have that.
Raymond,
Yes, please.
did the Western Church accept the Nicene Creed?
I'm not sure. Who knows?
Well, the Protestant Church,
Yes. Because
it's a Catholic Church.
Yeah.
it's a very, very basic.
Okay.
It's a very, very basic. Thank you. It's a very basic statement of what we believe.
Was the New Testament sort of spring out of this? You know, the New Testament and the books of the New Testament, did it spring out of these agreements?
I am so sorry. My hearing is really bad.
Did the New Testament, the written,
Yes,
did it also spring out of this? Was it kind of
not yet. I
from this?
don't think it's spread out, not yet. It had to be, the question was about the New Testament and the scriptures. They have to be translated by Saint Jerome into Latin. And then they moved on.
The New Testaments were written
Before.
in the first century.
Yes, the first century.
They were written prior.
Question was whether or not that was brought together. We have those different accounts.
No, not
Was it
yet.
brought together as the New Testament at that point? Or was it later after they had these
Yeah.
agreements?
Which gospels were accepted, because there were a bunch of gospels.
That's right, there's the Gospel of Thomas, there's the Gospel of a whole bunch of people.
Having a gospel at that time was also of relative value because so many people could not read or write. So it really didn't matter to have it written down for the vast majority of people who were illiterate. The great heresies, like we said before, came from the East, not from the West, not from the Diocese of Rome. Arianism, second person of the Trinity, the Logos, Christ, the Word, had been begotten at a certain moment in eternity past. We'll try to define that, and you have my respect. Adoptionism was Christ was adopted as Son of God either at his baptism, resurrection, or ascension. You'd be surprised how many people believe in this. Nestorianism was one of the Christological heresies, claimed that Mary was the mother of Jesus, not the mother of God. Hair splitting. Monophysitism was very popular for many centuries, questioned the dual nature of Christ, that Christ was God and human, or only God. The Second Council at Constantinople in 381 was different because by then Christianity had become the official religion. And what does official religion mean? The government owns you. The government may pay you, the government may support you, but the government tells you what to do. Religion, Christianity, the church, worship becomes a department of the state. Once again, the Second Council at Constantinople was called by the emperor, had nothing to do with the Bishop of Rome. It modified the Nicene Creed, affirmed the primacy but not the supremacy of the Roman Church. In other words, yeah, sure, you can be prime top dog, but way over there, not over here. At that time, Damasus was the first bishop of Rome who was called Pope by his contemporaries. It was almost at the end of the 4th century that this happened. It took a while for the word Pope to enter the vocabulary. It came from Papa, its father. He was recognized as the father of all the dioceses in the West. Another council of importance is the Council of Chalcedon in the middle of the 5th century. Chalcedon was there in southeast of Constantinople, close to Nicaea. It was called again by the emperor and the Pope Leo I, about whom we will discuss a few things, sent a statement called the Tome, not Tome, just the Tome, Tome. And it dealt with the business of the nature of Christ. Monophysitism advocated that Christ only had one nature. Well, that was a hit. Even though it was written in Latin, the church fathers really recognized, hey, this guy in Rome is good. This guy in Rome provides a lot of leadership. Probably this guy in Rome is better than what we have here, Constantinople. Actually, what they did say was, the Lord has spoken through Leo. The Lord has spoken through Leo. So it was a big win for the Church of Rome. Now, to review the first century or the first 4 centuries of the Catholic Christian Church, Christianity was originally a Jewish sect that grew along the lines of the Roman Empire. The development of ecclesiastical authority was slow, gradual, and fortuitous. The Edict of Milan was accepted by the Church of Rome, for the sake of political, military, and financial security. It was a very good deal for the Diocese of Rome. The Edict of Milan linked Christianity to political power for 1600 years. It was not until Mussolini finally allowed the Vatican to be its own independent state, that this link was broken. So the great intellectual struggles over doctrine were fought in the East, not in the West. Moving the seat of government to Constantinople created an enormous vacuum in Rome. But all those functions that the government left behind were taken up by the Christian church. It was powerful, it was wealthy, it was intelligent, it was smart, it had a lot of documents, and it was run up according to the civil government in the Roman Empire. Therefore, the Bishop of Rome and the Christian community became stabilizing institutions. Kept excellent records, organization, and communications. In the 5th century, have a few more minutes before we quit, the Huns came in and invaded Central Europe. Finally, the Roman Empire in the West fell in 476. The relations between Rome and Constantinople were not going well. There was more alienation of the Eastern Church and more and new heresies in the East, not in the West, in the East. The West recognized that these were in the East, wanted no part of it. Comes in Pope St. Leo the Great. One of the things that can be said about early Christianity and the Catholic Church was that at the time when they needed a real leader, one usually came forth. Time and time and time again, when they needed a good leader, one came through. Even when one leader was very weak, like Pope Pius and Napoleon, just after he died, he dealt a master stroke and saved the papacy. We're going back 1,000 years. Pope Leo the Great, claimed universal and supreme authority for the Bishop of Rome in ecclesiastical matters. He was the one who said, I am the Pope of the whole of Christianity. He wrote decretals. Decretals were the equivalent of executive orders nowadays. But those involved everything, not just church things, but everyday life issues. That way he really asserted his authority over the faithful and all bishops. He sent the Tome to the Council of Ephesus, and it was read out Chalcedon. Peter has spoken through Leo, was the claim. Then came Attila the Hun. Talk about one crisis after another. Attila the Hun threatened Rome, and there was the Roman authority, but the real power lied with the Pope, was the Bishop of Rome. So Leo I said, I'm going to northern Italy to meet this guy, Attila. Did he have guts or did he have guts? He really had a lot of courage. He met Attila personally. Attila actually retreated and not attacked Rome. Left Rome alone. Why did he do that? We'll see that in a moment. But Leo demonstrated really impressive courage and leadership to go from Rome on horseback and carriage all the way to northern Italy, through mountains and rivers and bad weather and whatnot, winter, and meet Attila face to face and say, Attila, leave Rome alone. Maybe he said that, maybe not. Why did Attila retreat? Well, maybe Leo bribed him. These people, when they traveled, always traveled with riches. They always traveled with a lot of gold, a lot of silver. Why? Because they knew that it may become handy. What did the Magi bring Jesus at the manger? 3 things: gold, incense, and myrrh. Gold, why? You're going to bribe somebody. Get through. So maybe, sorry, maybe Leo bribed Attila. Maybe Attila said, well, you know, this guy Leo may be a deterrent. Maybe a big army swinging around my back and going to attack me by surprise. Maybe his troops were ill. Maybe they had COVID. Who knows? And they did not want to fight anymore. They were tired. They had no more space to carry any more loot. Maybe they wanted to go home to their families and wives and concubines and whatnot. In any event, it is unlikely that Attila retreated because of respect for Leo. But let's face it, we all need our heroes. And the Christian church needed a hero, and Pope Leo was a hero. He had a lot of courage going up to northern Italy. Let's do this and then we'll quit for the day. Can't compare the Byzantine church with the Roman church. The Byzantine church lived in Constantinople, which was practically a village, Byzantium, when it was declared the new imperial capital. So there was really very little infrastructure, what we call infrastructure at that time, and very few traditions in Constantinople. On the other hand, the Roman Church developed throughout centuries of Roman culture and institutions, including Roman law. Such thing was not present in Constantinople. Number 2, Greek was the official language in the East. Latin was the official language. That created a lot of problems because they just could not understand each other readily. The Byzantine bishops considered themselves equal and collegiate, and that comes down to this day. The bishops in the East consider themselves on the same level. In the West, though, there is a pyramidal structure. There is the Pope, cardinals, the metropolitans, the archbishops, then the bishops. So it's all that pyramidal structure and certainly not collegiate. There are other differences like the leavened bread for communion, fasting, clerical celibacy, the timing of Easter, and the worshiping or veneration of icons. So all these things became different between one church and the other. Do you know what the difference is? The physical difference? We talked about the icons. The Bishop of Rome was relatively autonomous and wealthy. He was the top dog of the diocese. In Constantinople, the patriarch was dependent on the empire. He was an employee of the empire. The Byzantine church was the subject of the government. In Rome, the Roman church was the government. All right, so we can see why the two churches grew apart more and more. And we'll stop there and come back again next week with the Ostrogoth. We'll meet I'll be here a few minutes before we start. And if you want to bring anything for discussion, we have to find out, when was the Gospels? What was the point you made up?
Oh, yeah, yes, when did the Muslims take place?
But also there was the question of when did the Gospels come? The New Testament. When did
Yeah, what is that?
They should have become part of the Bible. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for bringing up such interesting observations. This is a very, very rich class.